Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today we want to talk about municipal water, so city water supplies and how do you maintain water quality in cities. And to start with, we're going to talk about drinking water. We're going to divide this up into two categories, drinking water and wastewater. So first off, where does your drinking water come from? Well, it can actually come from anywhere. Here in Dallas, we actually have 5 man-made reservoirs surface water, that we draw our water from, but it could come from a river stream, could come from lakes, could come from underground, so aquifers, and then, of course, reservoirs, the man-made situations. And then you can actually pull ocean water, right? So you can get your drinking water from ocean water. The problem with that is desalination is very expensive and very difficult, and so that's not that common a thing to do, but it's a possibility. All right, so we have to purify water in order to drink it, obviously, but water is purified naturally at which stage or stages of the hydrologic cycle? Well, actually, it can get purified at any of these. As it runs across the land surface, you can have, in slow water, sediment settle out of it, right? And that's a way to purify it. As it evaporates and condenses, it leaves behind, especially in evaporation, it leaves behind pollutants and things, pretty much anything that's in the water. As it percolates through the soil is a great filter. And as a matter of fact, as we start talking about water purification, one of the things that you're going to see is we use gravel and sand and charcoal to purify water, which it's going to come in contact to, or with rather, naturally. Okay, so when we treat drinking water, there's a real big difference between the output end of drinking water treatment and wastewater treatment. For drinking water treatment, it has to meet the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. It has to be completely clean. For wastewater discharge, right, release back into the ecosystem, it does not have to be as clean as drinking water does. And so municipal drinking water supplies and then wastewater are going to have different treatment plants. But most of the steps within the plants are pretty much the same in terms of, how do you remove dirt, right? How do you remove organics? How do you remove biologics, right? And all of that stuff. So here's just an overall kind of flow. You're going to go through and you need to get all of the dirt particles out of it. You've got to let it settle so sediment comes out of it. Then you filter it, and that can occur in many ways. A lot of treatment centers now actually do use membrane filters, and we'll talk about those later on. And then you want to disinfect it. Then it's stored in a water tower, right? So it's pumped up into a water tower, and then gravity will create a pressure there because it's pulling on it, and you can push it into houses that way. Now, I'm going to put in a lot of slides for this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading things to you. What I'm going to want you to do is I'm going to want you to go through and really understand what's happening in each of the phases of water treatment. And to that end, I've put in lots and lots of pictures like this. But essentially, you've got your raw water, that's the untreated water. You need to screen trash and stuff out of it. Then you add what are called coagulants, and we're going to do this in class. I'm going to show you a demonstration. We're going to use alum, and we're going to flocculate our water, and I'll talk about flocculation in just a second. Then you need to settle out all of this coagulated stuff, and then the water will flow off. It's then filtered, and I was talking about filtration earlier, and then I was saying that some treatment plants actually use membrane filters in addition to this, and we'll talk about that when we talk about new technologies. But the basic filters are the same thing that you're going to see in any water filter. If you have a Brita pitcher at home, you've got this, just a tiny version of this system right here with carbon, sand, and gravel. Then you want to make sure that the water is not too acidic, because if it's too acidic, it's going to eat away the pipes that it's traveling through, if it's traveling through any metal pipes. So to that end, you're going to correct the pH, and you're going to put anti-corrosion agents into it. Then you're going to chlorinate it or do some other thing that will kill the biologics, so bacteria, stuff like that. And then you're going to send it to homes. And then here's just another version of this. Right? Oh, this one adds in the fluoride that's added to most city water to prevent tooth decay. That's very exciting. Yay. Okay, so same stuff going on there. Now, there are some new technologies that have added in that are not the traditional ones, and those are these membrane technologies. And this is where you take basically a filter membrane that has tiny, tiny, tiny holes that allow water and not a whole lot else to go through. And the one that we're really going to focus on is and not in this conversation, but in a later conversation, is reverse osmosis, because we're going to talk about that in terms of desalinating water later on. Okay, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm going to talk about each of those phases as I talk about wastewater treatment, just because that's how I'm doing it. That's why. Okay, so drinking water, the goal of that is obvious. But why do we treat wastewater if we're going to put it back into the environment? I mean, it's going out of your house. You're not going to be around it. So the driving issues in the evolution of sanitation, right, wastewater treatment, sewage, one, smell, two, infectious disease. Those are the big, big things that go with raw sewage. And that, of course, leads to chronic health risks and their environmental concerns, because not only do you have these infectious diseases, but don't forget that sewage is nutrient pollution, right? And so you get eutrophication and all that stuff, and that is bad. Here is a little link to kind of the history of wastewater treatment, right? Sewage treatment. All right, so the major problems with sewage are going to include, for many towns and cities, stormwater and sewage are mixed together. Raw sewage often contains pollutants and dissolved nutrients. Raw sewage often contains infective pathogens that must be eliminated. Numerous substances are improperly disposed of into drains and storm systems, or all of the above. Well, on this one, it's all of the above. We've got two components in terms of wastewater, right? We've got stormwater and we've got sewage, and those are different systems. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. We know that raw sewage has pollutants. We know that it's got nutrients. Sewage, just from the toilet component, is going to have all these nutrients. But don't forget, people put lots and lots of stuff down the drains, right? And some of that is improperly disposed of. And then, of course, if you've got sewage waste, right, like human or animal waste, you're going to have infective pathogens. So all of the above. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between stormwater and a sewer system. Okay, stormwater is the water that is essentially runoff. It's coming through the street drains, it's running off from the streets itself, and in some cities that water is treated in a treatment system. In some cities it simply just travels through a piping system to a local body of water that is there to contain it. It's discharged. It could be a natural body, it could be a man-made body. So that's stormwater, right? For sewage, that's the stuff that is coming out of houses, buildings, whatever, and any buildings, municipal buildings, factories, there we go, sorry, factories, commercial buildings, schools, whatever, right? That's what's going to be in the pipes that are the drains. That is going to be the stuff that will go directly to a sewage treatment plant. It always goes to a sewage treatment plant, whereas stormwater, again, may or may not. Okay. All right, so in the water treatment process for wastewater, same thing. It's got to be cleaned. It's going to be cleaned in the same types of steps. You've got the filtration and the coagulants, and then you have in wastewater treatment, you're also going to have a biological component that you typically don't have in drinking water, and that's another change there. Then you're going to have to readjust the pH, and you're going to have to kill anything that's in it, including the bacteria that you put in it to clean it. So when we look at wastewater treatment, we are looking at preliminary, primary, secondary, tertiary, or final treatment, and sludge treatment. Those are the big components. And I actually put this diagram in because, one, it gives you a nice idea of what's happening in each of the treatment steps, but you're gonna see that over and over and over again through this particular lecture. But it also shows you that wastewater treatment can also be a cogeneration situation where you can generate electricity, because remember, as the water is flowing, you could use that flowing water to power an electrical plant, right? And so that's pretty exciting. You can use that as a coolant, or you can actually depending on the volume, use it to turn turbines. All right, so preliminary treatment. First, this is where you're going to be getting out the big stuff. In preliminary treatment, this is typically screening, and what you're looking at here, you can see the water. Water passes through this bar filter here, and you can see there's plastic bags and cups and, sanitary objects like tampons, things like that. And so you've got to get all of that stuff out before you put it into the environment. Okay, then you move into the primary treatment phase, and this is where you're going to do the fine screening. It's where you're going to do the sedimentation. Okay, so in primary sewage treatment, you start with a grit chamber, and this is going to slow down all the particulates in it and cause them to drop to the bottom. You're also going to end up in the primary sedimentation phase. You're going to do this again later on, but this is all the mechanical stuff up front. And then you will actually hold the wastewater for a while, and suspended solids are going to settle, and then floating stuff like grease and oil is skimmed off the surface. Okay, and so when you look at that, you end up having this kind of dual process. You've got the stuff at the bottom, this sludge at the bottom that's going to be taken and treated, and then you have this oil and floating yuck, gasoline, stuff like that off the top. Okay, then we move into secondary treatment, and that is going to involve a biological component, and it's also going to involve a chemical component. All right, but first, a toxic substance is accidentally dumped into the secondary treatment stage of a sewage treatment facility. Besides thoroughly washing out the toxin, what must occur before the facility will operate correctly? Electricity must be restored, a bar screen filter must be replaced, oxygen-rich air must be bubbled through the system, bacteria, protozoa, and other microorganisms must become established, or all of the above. Well, in this case, what you really have to do, besides thoroughly washing out the toxin, is you need to establish the microorganism community, okay? Because secondary treatment relies on bacteria and protozoa to actually facilitate this treatment, right, of getting all of these organic nutrients out. So you have to do number 4. All right, so the other thing that you have to do to make sure that all of your little guys are going to survive, and this is not about the toxin thing, this is just in general, to maintain your aerobic conditions, air actually is pumped through the tank. It doesn't necessarily have to be oxygen rich, it's just regular old air, and I'll show you in the next slide a picture of that, okay? And so the wastewater will flow through these tanks and let the bacteria and stuff do their work, and then anything that's solid, including bacteria and dead bacteria, are going to settle in your second round of sedimentation, and it looks something like this. It's lovely, isn't it? But you can see all of that air being bubbled through there. So here's your aeration tank. Bacteria are doing their exciting work. Then you move into the settling tank. You get more sludge. That's going to have to be treated. And then your effluent, remember that's the discharge, is going to be clear, hopefully, and cleaner than it was before. And then you're going to send that along. And here's another lovely picture of it, but you can see the water's passing really slowly through this series of channels. And the other component of this is going to be the chemical component. Okay, there are lots of things, especially your nutrients that are going to be in from organic waste that are going to be in this water. So here's your next question. By weight, the bulk of the phosphates in the Chesapeake Bay comes from air pollution, shellfish farms, pesticide runoff, or sewage treatment plants. This one should probably be obvious since we're talking about sewage. The answer is going to be sewage, right? Waste is a big deal. So what do we do with that? Flocculation is one of the things that we are going to do to ensure that we get rid of all of the nutrient pollution that's in there. And coagulation, remember we talked a little bit about coagulation in some of the primary treatment, but this is where the big push for flocculation goes. And so a floc is this little like particulate stuff that forms, and so you have a flocculating agent. In this case, we're going to be talking about aluminum sulfate, which is a common one. It's alum, and it is going to kind of bind up all of these little particulates, and it's going to form larger particles, and then you can actually put some polymers in there that'll speed up the coagulation, and then that's got to settle out, So you get another round of sedimentation, and we are going to flocculate a sample in class. You can see what that looks like. It's very cool. Here's the thing about all of the sedimentation that you've had through all of this treatment. It has to either go to a landfill, it can go to waste to energy, but it can be toxic, and we will talk about that later on. So every time we talk about the sedimentation or filtration, we've got stuff that we're going to have to deal with later. Okay, so secondary sewage treatment, remember, also includes the bacterial component, and there's some filters that are real common. There's the trickling filter, and you can see here the water comes through, and there's a medium where you have this biological slime, and that's going to be doing a lot of this treatment. And it's going to decompose waste. And then you also have another option, which is an RBC, or rotating biological contactor, and it's the same idea. You've got this medium, and it's got a microbial film, and the water flows through it. Okay, and then the slime will pretty much replace itself once this is self-sufficient. Okay, but you still get those solids off of it. They're going to have to be removed, that sludge. Okay. Then you can also have water treatments that have lagoons, and these are real shallow ponds that have algae and bacteria that treat the water. It's the same kind of a thing. Sometimes you'll have the various filters and you'll have a lagoon. You know, sometimes you won't. All right, so that brings us to tertiary treatment, and that is going to be our next conversation. The really important part about tertiary treatment is the disinfection. Okay, so really the big thing that for a long time people did was chlorine disinfection, and then the second step after that would have been dechlorination, because you put a lot of chlorine in it because chlorine is an oxidizer. It really reduces, it doesn't reduce, it actually inhibits the growth of pathogens. It by doing that, it's going to reduce the biological oxygen demand. It's actually going to help with odor and watercolor, and it'll oxidize metal ions, which means you can remove any of that if you want to. But also it makes them safer. I mean, think back to aluminum toxicity. Aluminum oxide is going to be different than just aluminum ions, right, as we talked about before. The one thing about chlorination, though, is that it does not kill viruses, and if you don't dechlorinate properly, you are going to have toxic water, and that is bad. So, chlorination is great, has some pitfalls, but it's also very inexpensive to do because chlorine is really inexpensive. I mean, you're essentially talking about bleaching the water, right? Now, some other things that people do. Ozone. You can bubble ozone through the water. It'll revert back to oxygen. It really destroys cell membranes, which is a great thing, and it can cause all kinds of damage, right, to cells. So it's good in terms of it's not going to be the environmental problem, and you don't have to remove it, right? It also means that you need to redo your treatment plant. So if it's an older treatment plant, then you'd have to refit it. Otherwise, you'd have to build it so you are making and bubbling the ozone through. You can also use ultraviolet radiation, which is what we actually do in the goggle cabinets here at school, and that is great because it'll destroy viruses and cells. It causes problems for DNA, and so that's actually a better thing in terms of really getting rid of the biologics. So a little bit on that final or tertiary sewage treatment. Now, the last thing that you have to do is the sludge treatment. And in sludge treatment, that was all that stuff that we pulled out of the water. You have to thicken it. Then you have to remove the water. You're going to digest it with more microorganisms. Some of them can be anaerobic, some of them will be aerobic. On the aerobic process, it's going to be similar to the sludge processes that we saw in secondary treatment. For anaerobic, we're just doing this in the absence of oxygen. The cool thing about this is that it actually makes methane, and you can use that methane to for cogeneration, which is very cool, for heating in the buildings or for even electricity generation, depending on how it goes. You'll also get water out of this process. Here's what it looks like when you're talking about your anaerobic sludge digesters. And then after the sludge treatment, in terms of the digesting, you are going to dewater it, and with that, you're going to really just squish it until all the water comes out. You can even put it into drying lagoons, which means the water naturally evaporates off, but most of the time it's going to be squishy types, so that's exciting. And then when you put it all together, it looks something like this. And then I have also put in this slide so you get the words that go with it, so you can kind of say, okay, what's happening in primary, what's happening in secondary, what's happening in tertiary. And in some treatment facilities, they've actually got an advanced treatment process too, and this may involve some of those membranes that we talked about when we were talking about drinking water. You may actually be talking about removing other contaminants, salts, things like that. Okay, so using what would reduce the amount of sewage output from homes and businesses? Well, one of the big components is toilets. If you had a composting toilet system, which we can talk about in class if you do not know what that is, then you would actually reduce a lot of the sewage that is coming to the sewage treatment plants. Now, it turns out that there's a bunch of stuff that doesn't get taken out. Most of these things are medications. So you look in here, you can see a bunch of them, although I think it's interesting you've got the sunscreen agents. A lot of those are not taken out, but interesting stuff here, just to give you an idea. There was a study that was done one time where they actually showed that illegal drugs also end up in water supplies. This is not going to be true for your drinking water, because remember, that is treated differently. So wastewater is not treated to the same degree as drinking water. So this is really just what's going back out into the ecosystem, not what is coming into your home. The other thing, veterinary medicines, people don't think about that, but we give a lot of medications to our pets. Yeah. Now, what if you don't live in a place that has a sewer system? You will probably have a septic tank, and a septic tank is a mini sewer system. You have a tank that has biologics in it, usually bacteria, that is going to digest all of the stuff that's coming out of your house, and then it is sent through a filtration field, right? That usually has you've put it in intentionally, so it's got gravel and sand, and this is sometimes called an aerobic leach field, but you're going to use the actual ground to do the second part of that filtration system, right? So you're doing secondary treatment and then primary treatment when you have a septic tank. And then here are just some more pictures. Here's the septic tank, here's the leach field, right? This is what the inside of the septic tank looks like. So you're pulling off the wastewater, and you're trying not to get the scum that stays on top. That's all those oils that we were talking about earlier. And then you have a sludge in the bottom. And if you maintain your septic tank well, and you keep the right microbes in there, you don't have to empty them out very often, actually. And then the last thing we want to talk about are gray water systems. These are just some schematics of how to recycle the water that's coming out of your house. Gray water, obviously, if it's coming out of one of the sinks, right, or the toilet, it's going to go directly, like the kitchen sink, it's going to go directly to the sewer system. If it is out of the washing machine or the shower or something like that, then it'll go into something that's very similar to the septic tank system that you have. As a matter of fact, it is a septic tank, and then you pump it back into landscaping or into your toilets, and that's a gray water system. All right, that is it for this set of video notes, and if you have any questions, please put them on the video notes board or ask in class, and thanks for listening. I will see you next time.